now recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Meijer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member, and thank you all of the other witnesses who have joined us here today. At our first full committee hearing, as Representative Slotkin mentioned, we meant to evaluate the threat of domestic terrorism following the events of January 6th. And the questions I asked were mainly on how we can shift away from the reactive approach that I think we've all too often seen, especially when grappling with the magnitude of the issue, and how we can be a bit more targeted on the front end so that we're addressing some of those underlying levers. And instead of just constantly creating new agencies, offices, programs, how can we better use existing capabilities in order to ensure that we're instituting reforms that target threats appropriately while measuring the effectiveness of those relative approaches. So that was one of the reasons why this week I joined my colleague on this panel, Mr. Malinowski, in calling for additional funding for DHS's Office of Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention, or TVTP, and its corresponding grant program. So that office provides technical, financial, and educational assistance to stakeholders to establish and expand local prevention networks, help the department combat all forms of violence, regardless of ideological motivation, but specifically to award funds on a competitive basis to states, local, tribal, and territorial governments, nonprofits, and institutions of higher education to establish those sustainable prevention capabilities. And the word that I think I never want us to forget, because it's the way that we avoid this just becoming a defensive partisan exercise, is violence. The word extremism gets thrown around a lot, but where our focus and where our issue is when that violent nexus, when that violent act is in the process or is planning to occur. And as Representative Slotkin has mentioned, that's something we saw in our home state of Michigan. It's something that we experienced during the assaults on the Capitol itself. It's where the First Amendment protections fall away because that has entered into a criminal act, a criminal behavior. And how can we ensure that we are appropriately mitigating while having the corresponding respect for civil rights and civil liberties? So on that note, Attorney General Nessel, I want to ask about your experiences with these challenges in our home state of Michigan. Obviously, you mentioned the Wolverine Watchman. We've talked about some of those specific threats and a legacy that goes back, over 30 years. But do you feel the role of DHS and the federal government in combating these kinds of violence? How have you found that cooperation to be to date? I know you touched upon fusion cells, fusion centers in a prior question, but just wanted to get your broad approach on how you feel that federal cooperation has been so far.
Sorry. Certainly I think we had great cooperation as it pertained to that particular set of circumstances, and that we worked very well together at that juncture. Like A.G. Ford, I will tell you that's not always the case. And being someone who, before I came to state government, I worked for a county prosecutor's office, the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office. We often had a lot of complaints about the coordination between the county level and the state level, and then the state level and the federal level. So we can always do better when it comes to that. Now, in terms of the DHS Targeted Violence and Terrorism Prevention grants, let me say this. That money, as you know, is for prevention, not for prosecution. From my perspective, what's needed to support the Michigan State Police and my office, and for MSP, intelligence sharing, really, between local police and MSP is really the greatest weakness, I think. Now, of course, MSP has fusion centers, but outreach and education to local law enforcement is badly needed so they can identify intelligence that really should be shared. And, sometimes the locals fail to properly assess and identify risk factors like individual behavior of local extremists at the early stages, so that it can be passed up so that we can evaluate whether this is a person who is truly inherently dangerous. Now,
I'm just going to reclaim a minute of my time. I know I'm running short, but I just wanted to clarify. get the sense from speaking with local law enforcement and even state partners that they feel it's a one-way information flow, that they're feeding information up but not necessarily having that be reciprocated by the federal government?
You know, I do sometimes get that from them, but I will say this, that lack of information flow goes both ways. And I've had several circumstances where we have cases that we will get it when it gets to a certain level, and we'll find out later on that there were indicators that an individual was dangerous and had aberrant behavior that one would think would lead to something more dangerous later, but we just never found out about it because nobody passed it up to us. And had we known about it to begin with, we could have prosecuted something, perhaps, you know, even a lower level misdemeanor, but it would have put this person, you know, under the guidance of the court, so that whether it's a mental health related issue or some other issue, that could be addressed before it turned into something much more dangerous. So at all levels, I think we are failing to some extent.
Thank you, Attorney General. Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you. I appreciate it. The chair recognizes Mr. Meijer. Please go ahead.
No, thank you, Madam Chair, and I would strongly support Michigan being first in the nation as well on that primary system. You know, I guess I want to circle back to a couple of comments that were made earlier. One by Attorney General Nessel on, you know, talking about how if there had been more information sharing, there could have been that ability to route somebody who may have been heading towards a violent outcome, and have them be able to seek the mental, or get them directed to the mental health treatment they might need. And then also Attorney General Ford, you know, I can't help but think of the Las Vegas shooter and how the unknown motives in that case are almost more disquieting than if it, oh, well, here we have a nexus to one extremist movement or kind of violent ideology or another. I think we've seen in the past week with the shootings, the mass shootings in both Atlanta and in Boulder. Obviously, we're still learning more about the tragic events in Boulder and what motivations may have been there. But this need on behalf of the public writ large in order to ascertain what that motive is, in order to kind of fit into a pre-existing understanding. And I can't help but find a relation between that and how so many of our domestic terrorism and international terrorism focus is on a group rather than you know, realizing that group is comprised of a number of individuals. And I've seen this personally, you know, through my my you know, political experience to date. That moment in which a you know, legitimately held and First Amendment protected political belief starts to devolve into essentially a pathology, a creation of an alternate reality, and then one that inherently justifies violence. I received a text the evening of January 6th from somebody who said, called me a traitor for not voting to decertify or object to the Electoral College process, and in the process said, you know, the real patriots were those who stormed the building. Now, how somebody gets to that understanding, and again, that understanding is not in and of itself, you know, a violent act, but you know, lays the groundwork, you know, creates the fertile conditions in order to have the justification for that violence that would otherwise, you know, be reprehensible, or that a reasonable individual would rightly view as reprehensible. So I guess, Attorney General Nessel, could you expound a little bit more, you know, on that notion of the dichotomy between, if we can have a group affiliation, it's a lot easier than to preempt violence. The Wolverine Watchman being an example, you know, versus the challenge when that same impetus, you know, is living at the individual level, and you cannot have a confidential source in that network. You're minimized in the ways in which that type of violence can be preempted.
Well, Representative Meijer, let me say this. Firstly, we sort of do that already at the individual level. And as I know that you're aware, in Michigan, we have something called the Ethnic Intimidation Act. And what it does is it allows us to take what is ordinarily a low severity assault of crime or a malicious destruction of property crime. And if it's a bias-oriented crime, we can enhance it from a misdemeanor to a felony. Why do we do that? Because we know that when you make a threat against someone based on their heritage, based on their national origin, based on their race, that it's not just a threat to them personally, it's often a threat to an entire community. And we also know that the mass shootings that you might see at a synagogue or at an Asian spa or what have you, normally they start off as something much smaller, a threat or a minor assault or a minor type of property damage. But if you can elevate it immediately because of that racial component or because of that bias-oriented component, you can often stave off a much more serious crime later on. So we do that with individuals already in Michigan. But in terms of designating a group of people with as a hate group, I think it is really impactful because you know that if you have a mission statement from a group and that is an anti-government or extremist mission that, say, seeks to overthrow the government, I think it's helpful that in terms of not just alerting people's attention and law enforcement's attention as to who those individuals are, and to be, concerned about their activities and to be watchful of them. But I think it's impactful in terms of later prosecutions as well, and holding people accountable when those activities turn towards the planning or the execution of violent crimes.